September 15, 1942. Commander Takakazu Kinashi stood in the cramped conning tower of I-19, a Type B-1 submarine prowling the waters south of the Solomon Islands. Through the periscope, he could see what every Japanese submarine commander dreamed of finding: an American aircraft carrier, massive and vulnerable, moving through the destroyer screen with the confident rhythm of a fleet that believed itself untouchable. USS Wasp, fleet carrier, over 20,000 tons of displacement, 60 aircraft, the kind of target that could change the course of a campaign. Kinashi had trained for this moment his entire career, had practiced the calculations and the approach angles until they became instinct rather than thought. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He closed to within 500 meters, close enough that the destroyer escorts should have detected him, close enough that a single depth charge pattern would crush I-19's pressure hull like paper. At 14:44 hours, Kinashi gave the order: fire all tubes. 6 Type 95 torpedoes, the legendary long lance weapons that Japanese engineers had perfected over decades, left I-19's tubes in a spread pattern calculated to bracket the carrier's position. 3 of them struck Wasp directly, ripping through her hull near the fuel tanks and magazines. Massive explosions tore through the carrier's internal spaces. Fires erupted instantly, fed by aviation, gasoline, and munitions. Within minutes, Wasp was a floating inferno, her damage control teams unable to contain the conflagration because the torpedo hits had knocked out electrical power. The remaining 3 torpedoes from that same salvo continued traveling, their momentum carrying them beyond the immediate target area, beyond the horizon, into a separate American task force centered around the carrier Hornet. One struck the battleship USS North Carolina, tearing a gash in her hull that would require months of repairs at Pearl Harbor. Another hit the destroyer USS O'Brien, damage that seemed manageable at first, but would prove fatal when the ship broke apart and sank a month later while attempting to reach the repair yards. 1 attack, 6 torpedoes, 1 carrier sunk, 1 battleship crippled, 1 destroyer destroyed. It remains one of the most devastating single torpedo salvos in naval history, a textbook demonstration of submarine warfare executed with precision and lethal efficiency. Kinashi had achieved what Japanese submarine doctrine promised was possible. A skilled commander with superior weapons could inflict casualties on the American fleet that would gradually wear down their numerical advantage, creating the conditions for Japan's decisive surface engagement. Except there was something Kinashi couldn't see from I-19's conning tower, something that no amount of tactical brilliance could change. While he celebrated his extraordinary success, while Japanese naval intelligence catalogued the sinking of Wasp as validation of their submarine strategy, something was happening 7,000 miles away on the other side of the Pacific that would render his achievement strategically meaningless. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, workers at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard were completing work on USS Gato, hull number 212, the lead ship of what would become America's primary submarine class. She would commission in December 1941. At Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, keels were being laid for 5 more Gato-class boats. At Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California, another 3 were under construction. At Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin, a facility that had never built a military vessel in its history, workers were learning how to fabricate pressure hulls and install torpedo tubes. The numbers told a story that Japanese naval planners either couldn't see or refused to believe. By the time Kinashi fired those 6 torpedoes at Wasp, American shipyards had already begun a production program that would build 77 Gato-class submarines between 1941 and 1944. That program would be followed immediately by 120 Balao-class submarines between 1943 and 1948. Then 29 Tench-class boats. The United States wasn't just building submarines, it was industrializing submarine production, turning what had been a specialized craft into something closer to an assembly line process. The Imperial Japanese Navy began World War II with 63 operational submarines, the product of 2 decades of development and construction. Many of these boats represented genuine technological achievements. The I-400 class, when it entered service, would be the largest submarine in the world until nuclear boats arrived in the 1950s. Japanese Type 95 torpedoes were faster, longer-ranged, and more reliable than anything the Allies possessed. Japanese submarines could dive deeper and cruise farther than most American designs. By every measure of individual vessel capability, Japanese submarines were world-class weapons. But capability and capacity are different things. Japan's shipbuilding industry, stretched thin between constructing battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and merchant vessels, managed to complete approximately 130 new submarines during the entire war. That sounds impressive until you realize it represents roughly 17 boats per year across a 4-year conflict. The United States, during just 3 years between 1942 and 1944, commissioned more than 200 submarines. American shipyards were delivering submarines faster than Japan could sink them, faster than Japan could even locate them, at a rate that made every Japanese submarine success a tactical victory inside a strategic catastrophe. The story of Japanese submarines in World War II isn't really about submarines at all. It's about the collision between doctrine and reality, between what military planners thought warfare would look like and what industrial capacity made inevitable. It's about highly trained crews achieving remarkable successes that couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of production. And it's about the moment when even the most optimistic Japanese naval officers had to confront numbers that made victory impossible. To understand how this happened, you need to understand what Japanese submarines were designed to do, and why that mission was doomed from the moment the first American production submarine slid down the ways in 1941. Japanese submarine doctrine emerged from a specific strategic vision of how the Pacific War would unfold. Japanese naval planners, heavily influenced by the writings of Alfred Thayer Mahan and by their own experience in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, believed that wars between naval powers were decided by decisive fleet engagements between capital ships. The side with superior battleships, properly deployed and skillfully commanded, would win the critical battle. Everything else was preliminary maneuvering leading up to that climactic moment. Within this strategic framework, submarines had a clear and limited role. They were to serve as long-range scouts, shadowing enemy fleets as they approached from across the Pacific. They were to conduct attritional attacks, gradually wearing down American battleship strength before the decisive engagement. They were to ambush damaged vessels, finishing off crippled ships that might otherwise limp back to port for repairs. What they were not designed to do, what their crews were not trained to do, was attack merchant shipping. This decision wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate strategic policy based on carefully reasoned assumptions. Japanese planners believed the war would be short, measured in months rather than years, decided by a handful of major naval battles. Commerce raiding was a strategy for prolonged conflicts, wars of attrition where economic strangulation could eventually force an enemy to negotiate. Japan couldn't afford a prolonged conflict. Every month, the war continued allowed American industrial capacity to build strength. Therefore, Japanese submarines needed to support the decisive battle strategy, not waste time hunting merchant vessels that wouldn't matter once the American battle fleet was destroyed. There was another factor, though Japanese naval officers would never have phrased it this way. Attacking warships was glorious. Submarine commanders who sank carriers or battleships became heroes, their exploits celebrated in official communiques and popular media. Attacking merchant ships was unglamorous work, the kind of mission that didn't generate the prestige that drove career advancement in the Imperial Japanese Navy's rigid hierarchy. So doctrine and incentive aligned, creating a submarine force optimized for a type of warfare that bore almost no relationship to how the Pacific War would actually be fought. The Americans started with similar assumptions. Pre-war United States Navy submarine doctrine also emphasized fleet operations, with submarines serving as scouts and harassers for the main battle line. American submarine commanders trained for the same kind of warfare that occupied Japanese strategic thinking. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. They practiced approaches against heavily defended capital ships, studied the timing and geometry of attacking moving task forces, learned how to penetrate destroyer screens, and position themselves for killing shots against battleships. Then Pearl Harbor changed everything. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft destroyed or damaged most of the United States Pacific Fleet's battleship force in a single morning attack. Hours later, Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Harold Stark issued new orders to the submarine force: execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. This meant that any Japanese vessel, military or civilian, warship or merchant ship, was a legitimate target. Submarines were authorized to sink on sight, without warning, without regard to the traditional prize rules that had governed naval warfare for generations. The decision was partly retaliatory, partly pragmatic. With the battleship force crippled, submarines represented one of the few offensive weapons immediately available to strike back at Japan. But it also represented a fundamental strategic shift. American submarines would target Japan's merchant fleet, the tankers and freighters that moved oil from the Dutch East Indies, rice from Southeast Asia, iron ore from the Philippines. They would strangle Japan's economy, cut the supply lines that connected the home islands to the conquered territories that provided essential raw materials. This wasn't how anyone had planned to use submarines, but it was how America's submarines would win the war. When the war began, both Japan and the United States Navy possessed roughly similar numbers of operational submarines, approximately 60 boats each. The Japanese advantage lay in individual vessel capability. Their submarines were larger, longer-ranged, and better armed than most American designs. The Type B submarines, like Kinashi's I-19, displaced 2,600 tons, surfaced, could cruise for 16,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, carried 17 torpedoes, and mounted a 5-inch deck gun. These were ocean-going weapons platforms designed to operate independently for months at a time across the vast distances of the Pacific. American submarines in late 1941 were a mixed collection. The bulk of the force consisted of older S-class boats designed in the 1920s, limited in range and reliability. The newer Tambor and Sago-class boats represented improvements but still fell short of Japanese capabilities in several key areas. The Gato-class submarines just entering service would finally give America boats that could match Japanese performance, but in December 1941, only one Gato-class boat had commissioned. The Japanese had reason for confidence. Their submarines were technologically superior. Their crews were well-trained and experienced. Their torpedoes worked as designed, unlike the defective Mark 14 torpedoes that would plague American submarines for the first 2 years of the war. And in those opening months, Japanese submarines achieved significant successes. They damaged the carrier USS Saratoga twice, putting her out of action for extended periods when the United States desperately needed every available flight deck. They sank merchant ships along the American west coast and near Australia. They conducted reconnaissance missions that provided valuable intelligence about American fleet movements. But even as these tactical successes accumulated, something else was happening that would prove more decisive than any single submarine attack. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, something was happening that would change the mathematics of submarine warfare forever. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard had been building submarines since 1917, but always at a measured pace. Peacetime production rates where a single boat took 20 to 22 months from keel laying to commission. Quality over quantity. Careful craftsmanship. Every weld inspected multiple times. Every system tested thoroughly before the boat went to sea. Pearl Harbor shattered that approach. In January 1942, Portsmouth began working on 6 new building ways, massive construction facilities that would allow multiple submarines to be built simultaneously. One was completed in March, 3 more in November, 2 in December. These weren't minor expansions. They represented a complete transformation of how submarines were built, a shift from artisanal construction to something closer to industrial production. The results were staggering. By mid-1942, Portsmouth was launching submarines every 6 months instead of every 2 years. By 1943, the yard was completing boats even faster, the construction time dropping to 9 months from keel laying to commission for some vessels. Workers laboured in shifts around the clock. Welders worked until their hands cramped, then were replaced by fresh crews. Components that used to be custom-fitted were standardized, allowing different work teams to fabricate identical parts that could be assembled with minimal adjustment. Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, underwent a similar transformation. Before the war, Electric Boat built submarines the way skilled craftsmen built fine instruments. Each boat slightly different, each one adjusted and tuned by workers who knew every peculiarity of submarine construction. The company had been building submarines since 1900, had supplied boats to multiple navies, had accumulated decades of expertise. But expertise at peacetime rates wouldn't win a war. Electric Boat received contracts for 46 Balao-class submarines in mid-1942, far more than the yard had ever built in its history. The company responded by expanding facilities, hiring thousands of new workers, and, most importantly, standardizing the construction process. Drawings were simplified. Tolerances were relaxed where they didn't affect safety. Components were designed for ease of manufacture rather than theoretical optimization. The goal wasn't to build the perfect submarine, it was to build good enough submarines in overwhelming numbers. The most remarkable expansion happened at Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin. Manitowoc had never built a military vessel. The company specialized in small commercial ships for Great Lakes cargo trade, ore carriers and grain freighters that never left fresh water. Submarine construction required entirely different expertise, different materials, different quality standards. Pressure hulls needed to withstand depths that would crush a Great Lakes freighter. Torpedo tubes required precision machining. Electrical systems needed saltwater-resistant components. Manitowoc learned from scratch, trained workers who'd never seen a submarine, built facilities for equipment they'd never handled. The company's location created unique challenges. Submarines built in Wisconsin had to be transported down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, then moved through the Gulf of Mexico to reach the Pacific. Some boats made this journey still incomplete, finishing their fitting out at coastal yards. But Manitowoc made it work, eventually producing 28 submarines during the war, boats that were indistinguishable from those built at the traditional submarine yards on the coasts. American submarine production wasn't elegant. It was brute force industrial capacity applied to a problem with single-minded determination. Between 1942 and 1944, American shipyards commissioned an average of 73 submarines per year. That's more than one submarine every 5 days, a rate that would have seemed impossible before the war, a rate that Japanese planners apparently never considered remotely plausible. Because here's what Japanese naval intelligence missed, or more accurately, what they saw but couldn't believe. American industrial capacity operated on a scale that had no precedent in military history. The United States in 1942 wasn't just the world's largest economy, it was larger than the next several economies combined. American steel production exceeded Japanese production by a factor of 5 to 1. American oil production was even more lopsided. American manufacturing capacity, once converted to military production, could build weapons faster than enemies could destroy them. This wasn't secret information. Before the war, President Franklin Roosevelt had announced ambitious production targets: 50,000 aircraft annually, tens of thousands of tanks, millions of tons of merchant shipping. German and Japanese intelligence services had dismissed these figures as propaganda, impossible boasts designed to intimidate Axis powers and boost Allied morale. How could a nation that ranked 18th in military strength in 1939 suddenly become the world's dominant military-industrial power in just 3 years? They couldn't see what made America different. The United States had been building automobiles for decades, millions of vehicles annually, using assembly line techniques pioneered by Henry Ford. American factories understood mass production in ways that traditional European and Asian manufacturing didn't. American industrial culture emphasized standardization, interchangeable parts, worker training programs that could turn farm boys into skilled machinists in weeks rather than years. When that industrial system converted to military production, it didn't just make more weapons. It made weapons differently, applying manufacturing techniques from consumer industries to military equipment. Submarines benefited enormously from this approach. Traditional submarine construction treated each boat as a unique vessel, custom-built to specific requirements. American wartime construction standardized everything possible. Gato-class submarines used identical diesel engines manufactured by multiple suppliers working from the same specifications. Electrical systems came from standardized components. Even torpedo tubes were interchangeable between boats. This meant repairs could be done anywhere, using parts from supply depots rather than custom fabrication. It meant construction could be distributed across multiple yards without coordination problems. It meant the entire system scaled in ways that custom construction never could. The Japanese submarine program couldn't match this. Japan's shipbuilding industry, while skilled and experienced, operated under constraints that American industry didn't face. Raw materials were limited, with steel and other metals rationed carefully across multiple competing military needs. Labor was scarce, with skilled workers pulled in multiple directions. Shipyard capacity was divided between submarines, surface warships, and merchant vessels, with constant disputes about priorities. Most critically, Japan's industrial base was smaller, less flexible, less able to adapt to the demands of total war. Japanese submarine production averaged approximately 33 boats per year during the war. That's one submarine every 11 days, a respectable rate by traditional standards, impressive given Japan's resource constraints. But it meant that for every submarine Japan commissioned, the United States commissioned more than 2. It was existential. By mid-1943, the mathematical reality had become inescapable. Japanese submarines had achieved genuine tactical successes. Besides Kinashi's devastating attack on Wasp, Japanese boats had sunk or damaged multiple American carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. They demonstrated that Japanese submarine doctrine worked in the narrow tactical sense. Skilled commanders with good boats could inflict significant casualties on American naval forces. But while Japanese submarines were sinking American warships, American submarines were destroying Japan's merchant fleet. United States Navy submarines operated under different doctrine, targeting the tankers and freighters that kept Japan's war economy functioning. They hunted oil tankers, bringing petroleum from the Dutch East Indies, the refined fuel that powered Japan's aircraft and warships. They attacked ore carriers moving iron and other metals from occupied territories. They sank food transports, cutting rice imports that fed both military forces and civilian populations. The statistics were brutal. 1942, American submarines sank approximately 600,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. In 1943, that figure increased to 1.8 million tons. By 1944, with the Mark 14 torpedo finally fixed, and with more submarines arriving in theater monthly, American boats were sinking Japanese merchant vessels faster than Japan could replace them. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping capacity. By mid-1945, that figure had collapsed to less than 2 million tons, with only 320,000 tons actually seaworthy and capable of carrying cargo. Japanese ports were full of damaged ships, awaiting repairs that would never come, victims of American submarine attacks that had left them crippled but not completely destroyed. The entire economic system that sustained Japan's war effort was failing, strangled by a submarine campaign that targeted not glory but logistics. Japanese submarines, meanwhile, continued operating under their original doctrine. They hunted American warships, achieved occasional spectacular successes, and made no meaningful contribution to Japan's strategic situation. Some commanders advocated for shifting to commerce raiding, attacking the American supply lines that stretched from the West Coast across the Pacific to forward bases. In October 1940, The Japanese Navy had actually conducted war games testing exactly this scenario, deploying submarines to simulate attacks on Japanese merchant shipping to understand vulnerabilities. The results had been alarming. In just 5 days of simulated operations, Japanese submarines had sunk 133 merchant vessels, demonstrating how vulnerable unprotected shipping was to submarine attack. Japanese anti-submarine capabilities were inadequate, convoy organization was poor, defensive doctrine was almost non-existent. The war games proved that commerce raiding could devastate Japan's economy if an enemy chose to pursue that strategy. Those findings were ignored. Japanese submarines continued targeting warships because that's what the doctrine specified, what the training emphasized, what career advancement rewarded. Even after April 1942, when Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu replaced Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu as commander of the main Japanese submarine force and placed greater emphasis on merchant shipping attacks, most Japanese submarines remained focused on warship targets. The few submarine squadrons that did shift to commerce raiding, particularly those operating in the Indian Ocean and along Australia's coast, achieved respectable results, sinking 125 merchant ships in 1942 alone. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough, because while Japanese submarines were celebrating individual successes, American submarines were destroying Japan's merchant marine as a functioning system. And more importantly, while Japanese submarines operated with the boats they had, American submarines were arriving in theater in numbers that made every Japanese success feel increasingly futile. By late 1943, the production gap had become a chasm. The United States had commissioned approximately 140 submarines since Pearl Harbor. Japan, during the same period, had commissioned about 60 boats while losing more than 40 to American air and submarine attacks, to accidents, to operational failures. The Japanese submarine force was shrinking while the American force was expanding exponentially. American submarines now operated from multiple bases scattered across the Pacific: Pearl Harbor, Midway, Brisbane, Fremantle, and later Guam. They had reliable logistics support, adequate spare parts, experienced repair personnel. They had intelligence advantages, with code breakers providing information about Japanese ship movements. They had improving tactics, aggressive commanders replacing cautious pre-war captains who hadn't adapted to unrestricted warfare. And most importantly, they had numbers. Enough submarines that losses could be sustained, that some boats could conduct specialized missions while others maintained pressure on merchant shipping, that the entire system could operate continuously without respite. Japanese submarines faced the opposite situation. With fewer boats available and more water to patrol, Japanese submarines spent longer periods at sea under increasingly dangerous conditions. American anti-submarine warfare capabilities improved dramatically as the war progressed. Destroyers equipped with better sonar hunted Japanese submarines aggressively. Aircraft with radar could detect submarines running surfaced at night, the charging position where submarines recharged batteries. American code breaking, though less publicized than efforts against German U-boats, provided warnings about Japanese submarine movements, allowing hunter-killer groups to intercept boats before they reached patrol areas. The strain showed in operational patterns. By mid-1944, many Japanese submarines were no longer conducting offensive patrols at all. Instead, they'd been converted to transport duty, running supplies to isolated island garrisons that American forces had bypassed. Submarines carried food, ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements to places like Rabaul and Truk, islands that were surrounded by American air and naval power but not actually invaded. This was necessary work, the only way to supply garrisons that would otherwise starve, but it represented a complete abandonment of offensive submarine warfare. A submarine's cargo capacity was tiny compared to a merchant ship's, perhaps 1/10 the tonnage at 50 times the operating cost. Using submarines as transports was desperately inefficient, a tacit admission that Japan's merchant marine had been so thoroughly destroyed that even inefficient alternatives were preferable to losing the garrisons entirely. Every submarine on transport duty was a submarine that wasn't attacking American shipping, wasn't scouting American fleet movements, wasn't available for the offensive operations that Japanese doctrine still theoretically prioritized. The human cost of this imbalance was staggering. Japanese submarine crews were some of the most highly trained personnel in the Imperial Navy, men who'd spent years mastering the technical skills required to operate complex boats under combat conditions. They continued executing their missions with the professional competence that had characterized Japanese naval operations throughout the war. But professionalism and skill couldn't change the fundamental arithmetic. Of the 176 Japanese submarines operational during World War II, approximately 130 were lost. That's a casualty rate above 70%, worse than German U-boat losses in the Atlantic, worse than any other branch of the Japanese military. Some were destroyed by American submarines in the Pacific's only sustained submarine versus submarine campaign. Some fell to destroyers and aircraft using increasingly sophisticated anti-submarine warfare techniques. Some simply vanished, lost to unknown causes in deep water where no rescue was possible. The American submarine force suffered heavy casualties too. 52 United States Navy submarines were lost during World War II, with 3,500 officers and enlisted men killed. The submarine service had the highest casualty rate of any American military branch, roughly 22% fatality rate. But American losses occurred within a growing force. Submarines were replaced faster than they were destroyed. Crews could be trained and retrained because there were enough boats that some could be pulled back for training duty. The system absorbed losses and continued expanding. Japan couldn't replace its losses. By 1945, the Japanese submarine force had effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful combat arm. The handful of boats still operational conducted limited transport missions or defensive patrols near home islands, unable to influence the war's outcome. American submarines, meanwhile, had expanded their operations into the Sea of Japan itself, penetrating through minefields to attack Japanese shipping in what should have been protected waters, operating with near impunity because Japanese anti-submarine forces had been overwhelmed. The final irony was that Japan possessed the technical expertise to build submarines equal or superior to anything the Allies fielded. The I-400 class submarines, 4 of which were completed before the war ended, were genuine engineering marvels. At 5,400 tons surface displacement, they were the largest submarines in the world. They could cruise 37,000 nautical miles at 14 knots, enough range to reach any ocean on Earth. They carried 3 sarin attack aircraft in a watertight hangar, making them the world's first submarine aircraft carriers. Their purpose-built planes could carry bombs or torpedoes, theoretically allowing submarine-launched airstrikes against targets like the Panama Canal. These boats represented exactly the kind of innovation and technical excellence that characterized Japanese naval engineering, but they entered service in 1944 and 1945, far too late to influence the war's outcome. Only 4 were completed from a planned 18-boat class, with the rest cancelled as Japan's shipbuilding capacity collapsed under the combined weight of resource shortages and bombing campaigns. The I-400 boats conducted no meaningful missions before Japan's surrender, technological showcases built for a war that was already lost. The Kaiten program illustrated the same pattern of innovation divorced from strategic reality. Kaiten were manned torpedoes, essentially modified Type 93 torpedoes with a small cockpit where a pilot sat, guiding the weapon toward its target in what was a one-way suicide mission. The program emerged from the same desperate logic that produced kamikaze aircraft. If Japan couldn't match American production, perhaps Japanese willingness to sacrifice lives could substitute for material disadvantage. Several hundred Kaiten were produced. They achieved minimal results, sinking or damaging a handful of American ships at the cost of dozens of Japanese lives. More importantly, they diverted resources from conventional submarine operations, with multiple submarines converted to carry Kaiten for attacks that rarely succeeded. The program was testament to how thoroughly Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated by late 1944, reduced to weapon systems that required suicide missions because conventional attacks had become impossible. The contrast with American submarine development couldn't have been starker. By 1944, American submarines were being equipped with improved radar, better sonar, more reliable torpedoes, enhanced fire control systems. The boats themselves were still fundamentally the same Gato and Balao class designs from earlier in the war, but continuous incremental improvements made them more capable with each passing month. American submarine development focused on making good designs better through systematic refinement rather than revolutionary new concepts. This reflected a broader difference in how the two nations approached naval warfare by the war's later stages. Japan, facing increasing resource constraints and strategic desperation, pursued technological solutions that might theoretically change the war's momentum. Super submarines like the I-400 class, suicide weapons like Kaiten, innovative but untested concepts that might somehow offset American material advantages. The United States, confident in its industrial superiority, focused on incremental improvements to proven designs, building more of what worked, rather than gambling on revolutionary new approaches. The numbers told a story that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome. Between December 7, 1941 and August 15, 1945, Japanese submarines sank approximately 184 merchant ships, totaling roughly 900,000 gross registered tons. They also sank or contributed to the sinking of multiple American warships, including 2 fleet carriers, several escort carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. These were genuine achievements, evidence that Japanese submarine technology and crew training were world-class. But during that same period, United States Navy submarines sank 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5.2 million tons. They destroyed 54% of all Japanese merchant shipping, strangling an island nation that depended entirely on maritime transport for oil, food, raw materials, everything needed to sustain both military operations and civilian survival. American submarines also sank over 200 Japanese warships, including 1 battleship, 8 carriers, and numerous cruisers and destroyers. The submarine campaign against Japan was the single most decisive factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy and, by extension, Japan's ability to continue fighting. The disparity wasn't just about sinking tonnage. It was about strategic focus, about understanding which targets mattered. Japanese submarines, operating under doctrine developed before the war, continued hunting warships, even as Japan's merchant fleet disappeared beneath the waves. American submarines, freed from pre-war constraints by the Order for Unrestricted Warfare, targeted the merchant shipping that kept Japan's war machine functioning. One strategy aimed for tactical victories, the other aimed for economic strangulation. By January 1945, Japan's shipping situation had become catastrophic. Imports of oil from the Dutch East Indies, which had provided 80% of Japan's petroleum before the war, had essentially stopped. The few tankers that attempted the voyage were sunk by American submarines patrolling choke points like the Luzon Strait. Without oil, Japan's navy couldn't sortie, its air force couldn't fly, its army couldn't move. Fuel rationing had become so severe that the super battleship Yamato's final sortie in April 1945 was only possible because the Navy gave the ship just enough fuel for a one-way trip, with no expectation she would return. Food imports had collapsed similarly. Japan had always relied on rice imports from Korea and Southeast Asia to supplement domestic production. By 1945, submarine attacks had cut those imports to a trickle. Civilian rations in Japanese cities had fallen to starvation levels, less than 1,500 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life. Industrial workers were too weak to maintain production schedules. The entire system was failing, not because Japanese factories had been destroyed, though bombing campaigns contributed, but because raw materials couldn't reach those factories and finished goods couldn't be distributed. This was the war American submarines had been fighting, systematically and relentlessly, since December 1941. While Japanese submarines chased glory through warship sinkings, American submarines were destroying Japan's ability to wage war at all. And they could do it because American shipyards produced submarines faster than Japan could sink them, deployed them in numbers that allowed continuous offensive operations, maintained them with logistics support that kept boats at sea rather than waiting for repairs. The production advantage had compounded over time. In 1942, the United States commissioned 32 submarines while losing 7, a net gain of 25 boats. In 1943, 49 commissioned against 6 lost, net gain 43. In 1944, 76 commissioned against 11 lost, net gain 65. By war's end, the United States Navy had over 200 operational submarines, more than triple what it started with, while Japan's submarine force had been reduced to a handful of boats conducting defensive operations near home waters. Commander Takakazu Kinashi, whose devastating attack on USS Wasp in September 1942 had demonstrated what Japanese submarines could achieve tactically, didn't survive to see how the production war turned out. In October 1943, he was promoted to command of I-29, one of the Type A submarines designed for long-range operations. I-29 conducted a remarkable mission, traveling from Singapore to German-occupied France in early 1944, carrying raw materials Japan desperately needed. In Lorient, France, Kinashi met with German naval officers and even travelled to Berlin, where Adolf Hitler personally awarded him the Iron Cross Second Class for sinking Wasp. The return voyage from France to Japan would prove fatal. American codebreakers, reading Japanese naval communications through the Ultra program, knew I-29's schedule and route. On July 26, 1944, USS Sawfish intercepted I-29 inches the Luzon Strait, the same waters where American submarines had destroyed so many Japanese tankers and transports. Sawfish fired 3 torpedoes. All hit. I-29 sank immediately with nearly all hands. Kinashi was promoted posthumously to Rear Admiral, recognition of his achievements, but his death illustrated the same pattern that had claimed so many Japanese submarines, operating in waters where American boats now dominated, against an enemy with better intelligence, superior numbers, and improving tactics. The lessons from the Pacific Submarine War extended far beyond World War II. When American naval architects sat down in the late 1940s to design the next generation of submarines, they had comprehensive data about submarine performance under combat conditions, information that peacetime testing could never provide. The result was a complete shift in submarine design philosophy. Post-war Tench and Tang-class boats were built with official test depths of 400 feet, but with the same safety margins that had allowed wartime boats to survive much deeper. The recognition that submarines needed extreme depth capability as a survival tool became fundamental to American submarine doctrine. More importantly, the emphasis on production capacity, on building adequate designs in overwhelming numbers, became central to American military-industrial policy. The Cold War submarine force that faced the Soviet Union was built on this principle. Maintain quantitative advantage through superior production capability, while continuously improving designs through incremental refinement. American nuclear submarines, starting with USS Nautilus in 1954, benefited from lessons learned building hundreds of diesel-electric boats during World War II. The Japanese experience provided different lessons, though ones largely ignored by post-war analyses focused on American success. Japan's submarine force failed not because of technological inadequacy or crew incompetence, but because strategic doctrine wasn't adapted when the war's nature became clear. Japanese submarines remained excellent weapons operated by skilled crews pursuing the wrong mission, hunting warships when merchant vessels mattered more, achieving tactical victories that had no strategic significance. The failure was institutional, doctrinal, a product of military culture that couldn't adapt quickly enough to radically different circumstances. There was a broader lesson about industrial warfare that transcended submarines specifically. Wars between industrial nations, particularly wars of extended duration, are fundamentally economic contests won in factories before outcomes are decided on battlefields. Germany learned this in World War I, Japan learned it in World War II. The principle has remained valid ever since. Military technology and tactical skill matter, but production capacity determines victory in prolonged conflicts between industrialized nations. The captured American supply, reports that circulated through Japanese intelligence channels in 1943, told this story clearly. Japanese analysts, studying American logistics documents from Italy, found that single American corps received more supplies monthly than entire Japanese armies. They saw fuel allocations that exceeded Japan's total production. They read requisition forms for ammunition quantities that would have exhausted Japan's munitions industry for months. The documents were authentic, verified through multiple sources, mathematically undeniable. They proved what some Japanese officers had suspected since Pearl Harbor. Japan was fighting an enemy with such overwhelming industrial superiority that military victory was effectively impossible. Those reports were ignored, or more accurately, acknowledged but not acted upon. Japanese leadership couldn't accept that the war was unwinnable, that every month of continued fighting would only increase the scale of ultimate defeat without changing the outcome. So the war continued for another 18 months beyond the point when intelligence analysts had documented mathematical certainty of defeat. Millions died in that final phase. Cities were destroyed, populations were decimated, all while professional intelligence assessments sat in files showing the futility of continued resistance. The submarine war was a microcosm of this larger pattern. Japanese submarines achieved genuine tactical successes throughout the war. Kinashi's attack on Wasp, I-168's sinking of USS Yorktown at Midway, I-26's torpedoing of USS Juno with massive loss of life, I-175's sinking of escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay. These were real achievements by skilled commanders, proof that Japanese submarine doctrine could work in the narrow tactical sense. But none of it mattered because American shipyards were producing submarines faster than Japan could destroy them. American submarines were destroying Japan's merchant fleet faster than it could be replaced, and the entire economic system that sustained Japan's war effort was collapsing under the weight of a submarine campaign that targeted logistics rather than glory. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the United States Navy had commissioned 263 submarines during the war. Japan had commissioned approximately 130. American submarines had sunk 54% of all Japanese merchant shipping and 30% of Japanese warships. Japanese submarines had sunk about 1% of Allied merchant shipping. The numbers weren't even close. The disparity was so enormous that tactical skill couldn't bridge it, that individual acts of heroism couldn't change it, that no amount of courage or technical innovation could overcome the fundamental arithmetic. There's a memorial at Yokosuka, Japan, near one of the Imperial Navy's major bases, honoring the approximately 3,000 Japanese submariners who died during World War II. Many have no graves, lost with their boats in deep water where recovery was impossible. Their sacrifice was real, their professionalism unquestionable, their tactical achievements genuine, but they were fighting a war their nation's industrial capacity couldn't support. Pursuing a strategy that didn't address the actual mechanisms of defeat, achieving successes that were strategically meaningless within the larger context of industrial warfare. The American Submarine Memorial in Pearl Harbor tells a different story, one of victory at tremendous cost. 3,500 American submariners died during World War II, the highest casualty rate of any American military branch. 52 boats were lost, each one a tragedy for the families who lost fathers, sons, brothers, but American losses occurred within a force that kept growing, kept adapting, kept pressing the offensive until Japan's capacity to resist collapsed. American submariners knew they were fighting a war of attrition, that their mission was to destroy Japan's merchant fleet no matter how long it took, that their commanders could sustain losses because replacement boats and crews would keep arriving from American shipyards and training bases. The fundamental lesson from the Pacific Submarine War isn't about submarines at all. It's about the importance of aligning tactical operations with strategic objectives, about understanding which targets actually matter, about recognizing when doctrine needs to change because circumstances have changed. Japanese submarines were technologically advanced, expertly operated, and strategically irrelevant because they were optimized for a type of warfare that didn't match how the Pacific War was actually decided. Commander Kinashi's 6 torpedoes that destroyed USS Wasp, damaged USS North Carolina, and sank USS O'Brien represented the peak of Japanese submarine tactical achievement. 1 attack, 1 salvo. 3 major American warships destroyed or crippled. It should have been the kind of success that changed campaigns, that validated doctrine, that demonstrated what submarines could accomplish. Instead, it became a footnote to a larger story about industrial capacity and strategic misdirection, a tactical brilliance that couldn't matter because the war was being decided by production rates in shipyards 7,000 miles away. While Kinashi was lining up his attack that September morning in 1942, workers at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard were welding pressure hulls for submarines that would sink Japanese merchant ships by the hundreds. Workers at Electric Boat were installing torpedo tubes in boats that would strangle Japan's economy. Workers at Manitowoc were learning submarine construction from scratch so they could add to the flood of American boats entering the Pacific. And workers across America's vast industrial infrastructure were producing the steel, the diesel engines, the electrical components, the torpedoes, the 1,000 components that went into each submarine, doing it at a scale that made Japanese production look medieval by comparison. That was the real battle, the one that mattered, the one that determined victory. Not the tactical engagement between submarine and target, but the industrial contest between production systems. Japan couldn't win that battle. The numbers prove it. Between 1942 and 1944, just 3 years, the United States built over 200 submarines, while Japan built approximately 70. American shipyards were delivering submarines at 3 times the rate Japanese shipyards could manage, using industrial techniques that treated submarine construction as a manufacturing problem rather than a craftsmanship challenge. Japanese submarines sank 375 Allied ships during the entire war. Most were merchant vessels, some were warships, all represented genuine tactical achievements. But in the same period, American shipyards produced 303 submarines just in those crucial 3 years between 1942 and 1944, more than replacing every boat lost, building faster than Japan could sink them, creating numerical superiority that made American submarine operations sustainable, while Japanese submarine operations became increasingly desperate. That ratio, 303 built versus 375 sunk, tells the entire story. Japan's submarines could sink ships. American shipyards could build submarines faster than Japan could sink them. In industrial warfare, arithmetic always wins. Production capacity always triumphs over tactical skill. The side that can sustain losses while maintaining offensive pressure will eventually overcome the side that can achieve brilliant successes but can't replace lost capacity. Commander Kinashi understood submarine warfare. He knew tactics, knew how to approach targets, knew how to fire torpedoes for maximum effect. What he couldn't see from I-19's conning tower was that his greatest success meant nothing strategically, because American shipyards would build more carriers, more battleships, more destroyers, faster than Japanese submarines could sink them. And while Japanese submarines chased glory through warship kills, American submarines were systematically destroying the merchant fleet that kept Japan's war machine functioning, doing it with more boats, better logistics, and doctrine that targeted what actually mattered. The captured supply charts that Japanese intelligence analysts studied in late 1943 documented this reality in numbers that couldn't be disputed. American production was overwhelming. American logistics were abundant. American industrial capacity was operating on a scale that made victory impossible for any nation that couldn't match it. The submarine war proved this principle conclusively. No amount of tactical brilliance could overcome such fundamental disparity in industrial capacity. The mathematics were clear, the outcome was inevitable, and 303 submarines built in 3 years versus 375 ships sunk in 4 years was just one more data point, proving what should have been obvious from the beginning. Industrial capacity determines victory in modern war, and America's industrial capacity was simply unstoppable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.